Today I want to walk you through a day of stories that matter, a high-stakes summit between two powerful leaders, mounting humanitarian pain in Gaza, a controversial plan in Washington, D.C., to clear homeless encampments, a fierce fight over how states draw voting maps, a possible major shift in U.S. drug policy, and a tiny heartwarming moment from a dog that reminds us what community looks like. If you want clear, calm context for all of that, and a few questions you can bring into your next conversation, stick with me. And if this is your first time here, please right now like this video, leave a comment with your thought, and subscribe so you don't miss more explainers like this. Your support helps us keep making honest, careful coverage. Let's begin with the headline that everyone is talking about. A face-to-face meeting between President Trump and President Vladimir Putin in Alaska. Imagine two of the world's most powerful presidents sitting down in a place with a long history and complicated symbolism. The goal, according to the American side, was to try to stop the fighting in Ukraine and create a pathway toward a ceasefire. The White House described the meeting as a listening exercise, a first step, not a final answer. And President Trump himself said the odds of failure were meaningful but that the meeting could set the stage for future broader conversations. That plan carried a huge question. If one of the parties did not deliver meaningful answers, there might not be a second meeting. This was not just a photo op. It was a gamble on whether quiet diplomacy could push two sides closer to a pause in the fighting. When you peel the diplomatic layer back, you see why people felt both hope and unease. On the one hand, any opening to reduce bloodshed sounds worth exploring. On the other, giving a global stage to a leader who began a war raises fears about the optics and the possible outcomes. Some analysts warn that the meeting could at best create small steps toward de-escalation, and at worst be used by others as evidence that diplomacy alone can erase the hard realities on the ground. There's also a practical problem. The leader of the country most affected by this war, Ukraine's president, did not attend. Leaving the main party out of early talks makes anything but a temporary pause seem unlikely. The whole effort was being watched by NATO allies, European leaders, and millions directly affected by the fighting. And they were all judging whether this meeting might finally push the conflict toward meaningful negotiation or simply paper over the deeper disputes. There was another layer to the Alaska choice that brought history into the present. Alaska had once been Russian territory before being sold to the United States in the 19th century. That past added a strange echo to a modern meeting meant to limit war in Eastern Europe. Politicians and analysts were drawing small lessons from large history. Meetings between great powers carry symbolic weight, and sometimes symbolic weight becomes part of the negotiation itself. Some in Russia publicly praised the idea of the U.S. leader meeting with their president, and conversations even floated around the possibility of discussing strategic arms agreements, long-term, complex security topics that reach beyond the immediate crisis. That meant the meeting was not just about a ceasefire in Ukraine. It could touch the longer arc of European and global security. Across the ocean and the region, another story demanded attention. Gaza. The bombardment in parts of Gaza had intensified, and aid groups warned that the humanitarian situation was deteriorating fast. Reports from multiple international organizations and journalists described hunger and desperate conditions for civilians trapped in conflict zones. When humanitarian groups speak about rising malnutrition, disrupted aid routes, and overwhelmed hospitals, those are not abstract terms. They are signals that people lack basic food, medicine, and safety. The world responded with a complicated mix of outrage, calls for humanitarian access, and questions about how to make sure aid actually reaches the people who need it most. In short, the human consequences of conflict can ripple across borders and demand urgent attention from every leader who cares about human life. The news cycle can be cold and distant when it treats people as statistics, but a single moment can bring it back to us all. Consider the image of people lining up for food in a place where supplies are scarce. That image isn't about politics alone. It's about faces and names and children who need feeding. Aid workers point out that even when weapons fall silent, the aftershocks, hunger, disease, and displacement, can last a generation. That's why conversations about ceasefires are not just geopolitical chess. They're urgent efforts to protect people. And the reality is this: when fighting continues, aid becomes harder to deliver, and when aid becomes harder, people pay the price in hunger and lives lost. The moral question is simple. How many ways can we find to get help to people in need despite the politics? The moral answer is harder to put into action. Back in the United States, headlines had an altogether different feel, but they carried similar moral tension. How to balance public order with compassion. Washington, D.C. became the site of a controversial plan to remove homeless encampments from public spaces. The proposal combined offers of shelter and services with enforcement measures, including fines or jail time for those who refuse help. Local officials and federal leaders framed it as a public safety and beautification plan, while activists and service providers warned about the risks of pushing people out without safe housing to go to. There are always hard questions here. When a community looks torn by visible homelessness, do you focus first on clearing the streets or first on making sure every person has a real, stable place to live? If you clear encampments without a clear plan for housing, the underlying harm, the lack of housing, mental health support, and addiction services, does not go away. Instead, people end up shuffled around, more hidden and often more vulnerable. The conflict over homelessness is not just a policy debate. It is a moral conversation about how we treat our neighbors who are most visible and most vulnerable. Some advocates point to faith communities, local nonprofits, and volunteers as lifelines that can provide shelter and counseling, while critics argue that the government's approach risks criminalizing poverty. The practical reality is complex. When a city tries to be cleaner and safer, it can still be compassionate, but it takes planning, money for housing, and long-term support programs. Quick fix sweeps may look decisive, but they rarely solve the root causes that produce homelessness in the first place. If a community wants a long-term solution, the first step is to put housing at the center of the strategy, and then offer the intensive services people need to rebuild their lives. It's easy to think these stories, an Alaska summit, Gaza's suffering, DC's encampments, are separate threads. But they tie together on a deeper level. Leadership choices matter, and how leaders balance power, principle, and care determines whether people feel safer or more exposed. That same theme echoed in the domestic political fights about redistricting. Across states, leaders were wrestling with maps and rules that decide who represents whom in Congress. In Texas, a mid-decade push to redraw districts sparked dramatic responses, including Democrats leaving the state to slow the process. In California, political leaders reacted by proposing measures to push back. This tug-of-war over redistricting feeds a broader worry. When political rules change mid-decade, do they protect fair representation or do they become tools to stack power? For many voters, redistricting is not an abstract rulebook issue. It directly affects which candidates get elected and whose voices are heard. The stakes are high because the winners from a single map can hold power for years. This is where process matters as much as the policies themselves, and why citizens should care about how lines are drawn. At the same time, national policies were shifting in ways that might touch everyday life for millions. The federal government was considering reclassifying marijuana from its strictest category down to a less severe schedule. That change could have major consequences: reduced tax burdens for legal businesses, broader access to banking, and more research into medical uses. It could also shape criminal justice outcomes and the future of the cannabis industry. People who work in healthcare, law enforcement, and business all watch these possible changes closely. The ripple effects could be big. Supporters of reclassification argue that it would allow better science and safer business practices. Opponents worry about public health and the social costs of easier access. Whatever decision comes, it will not be a small one. It could reshape how states and the federal government regulate and treat cannabis for years to come. After a day of heavy headlines, I want to bring you a human moment that reminds us why community matters. In Southern California, a 7-year-old Labrador named Emmy started doing something simple. Every evening she walked to a neighbor's house and rang a special doorbell to say hello. Her neighbor installed the tiny bell because Emmy visits like clockwork. The videos of her little ritual spread, and suddenly a small act of friendship was a tiny island of warmth in a sea of hard news. The story of Emmy shows that even while leaders argue about maps or treaties, ordinary kindness keeps neighborhoods alive. It's a small mercy, and sometimes small mercies are exactly what people need. When you place all these threads together, diplomacy and wartime suffering, local policies and human smallness, you can see that leadership is always about choices that affect real people. Meetings between presidents can offer hope for peace but also risk dangerous deals. Humanitarian crises demand urgent access and moral clarity. Housing policies test our commitment to dignity. Redistricting fights test democratic rules. Drug reclassification debates weigh public health against personal freedom. And a dog's nightly visit shows how little things can bind a neighborhood together even when larger forces pull it apart. So how should a thoughtful person respond to all of this? First, stay curious and kind. Read multiple sources, listen to those directly affected, and recognize that some issues, like war and hunger, deserve urgency and compassion. Second, ask practical questions. When a leader promises change, what are the clear steps they propose? When a city clears an encampment, where will the people go? When a government considers reclassifying a drug, who benefits and who might be harmed? These are not intellectual exercises. They are ways to make leadership accountable. Third, take small local actions. Volunteer a few hours at a shelter, reach out to a neighbor, or support reputable organizations helping refugees or displaced families. Big systems require big answers, but small acts of care matter right now. Now, I want to pause and reflect on the idea of trade-offs. In the Alaska meeting, one leader might push for a quick pause that looks like peace but leaves many questions unresolved for Ukraine. The trade-off is immediate reduction in violence versus long-term territorial and political settlement, a classic dilemma in diplomacy. In D.C., there is a trade-off between public order and the risk of criminalizing poverty. In redistricting, the trade-off is between political advantage and fair representation. Good governance is not about avoiding trade-offs. It's about making them transparently and with the people affected in mind. Leaders who hide the trade-offs often create deeper problems down the line. Another reflection. The stories we cover are often a mirror for our own communities. The question that a city faces about its unhoused neighbors is a question about how we treat vulnerability. The question that the world faces about ceasefire negotiations is a question about how we protect human life in the shadow of politics. The redistricting fights show how small technical rules shape big political outcomes. The potential reclassification of marijuana shows how regulatory categories can have large social consequences. And Emmy the dog reminds us not to lose our softness in the middle of all these debates. If you want to be part of the conversation, here are a few concrete things you can do. For the international crisis, support trusted humanitarian groups that provide food, medical care, and relocation services. For the homelessness issue, ask local officials what concrete housing plans are in place and how volunteers and faith groups can help. For redistricting, read your state's laws and contact your representatives about transparent, independent processes. For marijuana policy, read the evidence from health experts and support balanced approaches that protect children and support medical research. Small actions grounded in facts and compassion turn frustration into meaningful change. At the end of the day, public life is full of uncertainty, and the best way forward is often slow, careful steps that keep human dignity front and center. That's true whether we are talking about diplomats trying to stop a war, city leaders trying to manage public safety, or neighbors deciding how to care for each other. It's also true about the big technical changes that most people don't follow until they hit their local news. Those changes affect money, research, and public health in ways that matter to your family, your neighbors, and the next generation. Before we close, I want to hear from you. Which of these stories did you find most important today? Do you think diplomacy in a remote place like Alaska can help stop a war? Or do you fear symbolic meetings without real inclusion of all parties? What should cities do first when they try to help people living on the streets? And for the lighter moment, do you have a story about a neighbor or a pet that made your day? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read as many as I can and we use your ideas for future videos. Finally, if this long look across big headlines and small moments helped you think clearly about what's happening, please do one more thing for me. Like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and leave a comment to tell us what you want us to cover next. Your engagement helps keep this channel going, and it helps other curious but busy people find fair, calm reporting. Thanks for spending this time here. Keep your heart open, your questions sharp, and your kindness in reach. Until next time, stay informed and take care. And yes, one more reminder for those who scrolled straight to the end. Like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps.